Good morning. I'd like to welcome you today, whether you are here because you are an alum or interested in the topic. We are so glad that you are with us. I want to thank especially Steve Newcom, who is the director of the Center for Public Ministry. This year we've collaborated with them for this topic, and we think it'll be very exciting. I wonder if people would be willing to shake hands with someone near them and just say welcome. We've already been, some of us, in worship, but let's greet each other. All right. It's good to be together. I should remember this never works. All right, if we could gather again together.
I just want to say welcome.
Oh, David, how are you? It's so good to see you. Good to see you too. Good to see you. If you have the capacity to do so, I'd like to invite you to check in on Facebook, if your phone allows you to do that. And while you're checking in on Facebook that you're at United, you could like United. You could like the center. And we want this conversation to be wide. And so if you are a person who does Twitter, you can Twitter today with the hashtag that you'll find on the top of the schedule. I know this isn't everyone, but some of you have grandchildren, so I bet you have iPhones. So we want to keep our comments out in the community as this important conversation continues. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the 8th president of United Seminary, newly inaugurated, full of enthusiasm, spirit, and passion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barbara A. Holmes.
Good morning and welcome home. This has been a whirlwind year. I understand graduation is upon us. It feels as if I just got here yesterday. This has been an exciting time in theological education, and I'll talk to you more about that at lunchtime. But I want to give you just a brief synopsis. So what is the future of theological education at United all about? Well, we're going to be about many of the things we've always been about. We're going to do it in a broader and wider and more inclusive way, and we're going to be inviting more partners to the table. So we will be advancing justice and peace as essential to spiritual development and human striving. We'll be welcoming, as always, of individual views and differences, theological, social, sexual, and political. We'll be encouraging interfaith connections and dialogue. That's one of our new and exciting initiatives. We'll be exploring online education so we can broaden our reach from the classroom to the world. As always, we'll be embracing arts and creativity as a primary way of connecting with God. We're going to be promoting entrepreneurial thinking. The pastor is entrepreneur as community leader, as one who knows how to run the church as an organization that's well-led, well-organized, and also communicating with folks who are not sitting in the pews, folks who are in the business community, folks who are in politics, folks who believe and folks who do not believe. And we'll be preparing ministers for yet unknown forms of spiritual community. We do not know yet what the future will be, for we see through a glass darkly. But by and by, we are going to be faithful to the task, to the mission before us, and we want your input. Please check in with us. Figure out where we're going. We're going to be sharing with you widely. And join us as we journey forward. We want to participate with God in what God is doing in the world. And now it is my delight to introduce you to some and to welcome him again to the podium, Steve Newcom. I have told Steve on many occasions, if he wasn't here, I'd have to invent him or go find him. He is the director for the Center of Public Ministry, which is going to be one of our forward arms into the future. Steve, would you come up?
Thank you, Dr. B. It's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Butler. She's the founding executive director of Faith in Public Life. Before leading FPL, Jennifer spent 10 years working in the field of international human rights, representing the Presbyterian Church USA at the United Nations, and is an ordained minister. While mobilizing religious communities to address the AIDS pandemic and advocate for women's rights, she grew passionate about the need to counter religious extremism with a strong religious argument for human rights. Out of that experience, she wrote Born Again, The Christian Right Globalized, which was published by the University of Michigan Press. Her book calls for progressive religious response to the religious rights efforts to take the culture wars global. Jennifer served in the Peace Corps from 1989 to 1991 in a Mayan village in Belize, Central America, where she discovered she was, at heart, a community organizer. A graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, she also studied public policy and community organizing and graduated with a master's in social work from Rutgers University. She's a graduate of William and Mary College. Jennifer and her husband Glenn live in DC and run a group called the Iona Conversations, which brings together over 1,000 people in a Christian spiritual community in downtown Washington, DC. When not dreaming up ways to amplify the social justice voice, Jennifer loves hiking and camping and biking with her husband and son. I first met Jen during my fellowship research, and have watched her take a fledgling idea of unifying and amplifying the progressive religious voice and has turned it into a premier religious strategy center. She is dedicated, creative, collaborative, and deeply innovative. I have the honor of serving on her board of directors, which means I get to pretend I had something to do with all of her success. Please join me in warmly welcoming Jennifer Butler.
Well, hello, everybody. It is great to be here. I just was thinking about just being in the state of Minnesota, where there is so much incredible organizing happening, some of which we heard about in the sermon this morning. And I said to Steve after the worship, I took the worship bulletin, folded it, and put it in my bag, and said, this is a keeper. That doesn't happen often, unfortunately, in the places where I worship in my life, unfortunately, except for when I'm doing Iona Conversations with my husband. I've been asked to talk today, at least in my first presentation, about the Path to Irrelevance. Now, I'm a horrible person at coming up with titles, so I have to blame that one on Steve Newcom. How did we get to where we are in the church today, such that often, and maybe you have this experience too, if I'm at a party and introducing myself or at the schoolyard and people say, well, what do you do? And I say, I work in religion and politics. And I just wonder what's going through their mind, right? And so the first thing is like, I'm a Christian and I'm working in interfaith, progressive religious organizing, and I'm not like them. I am not the Christian right. Don't misunderstand me. Now, luckily in DC, we happen to live in a community where people go, oh, E.J. Dionne, yes. It's such a big relief. There's a voice out there that they can latch onto and understand what I'm saying. But when I first got to Washington, D.C., it sort of was more like this. It was 2004. It was after George W. Bush had been reelected. And there was this thing called the values voter that everybody was talking about. And of course, the values voter was not the values that we heard in this worship and the values of United Theological Seminary and the folks in this room. It was the voter who opposed gay marriage and the voter who opposed women's right to choose. And a number of people were very upset about that, and many of us around the country were upset about that, but a number of leaders in Washington and religious leaders around the country said, enough. We have to take responsibility to do something to change this. We can't let things go on as they have been going on. And so they started Faith in Public Life to be a strategy center, a communications center that would help amplify the voices of social justice faith leaders that we knew were out there. We knew that they were actually the true moral majority, but they were not being heard. And what I want to talk about today is how did it come to be that we were not being heard? Because in looking at the problem and the history of our losing our voice in public life, and even in congregational life, in that problem and defining that problem and really delving into it is also the solution. So today might be sort of like Good Friday, but my ending speech, I hope, is going to be more like Resurrection Sunday, so bear with me on that. So when I got to Washington, here's one of the first things I heard. I was asked to start the Strategy Center, and a lot of folks had come together to found it, and that was exciting. And it was sort of like a dream come true to me because I'd been working for 10 years in international human rights, and I'd seen what the religious right was doing around the world. Religious extremism was on the rise. We had the Taliban in Afghanistan. We had even fundamentalism within Hinduism in India, and it was happening everywhere. And it had a severe impact on women's rights, but also on democracy and many other important issues. And so I was really excited to start the Strategy Center, and I got into an elevator with a famous person who shall remain nameless, who had worked for the Clinton administration, and he turns to me in the elevator, and I'm a little nervous and intimidated. He says, well, what are you here to do? And I said, well, I'm here to start a Strategy Center and bring back the progressive faith voice. And he looks at me as we got to the curb outside the building, and he says, progressive religion? Isn't that an oxymoron? And he walks across the street and the light changes and I'm like, wait, no, it's not an oxymoron. So I didn't get a chance then to make my case. On the other side, I met with all of the key sort of progressive religious leaders that had helped found us and some who ran some of the Washington offices. And a number of them who I met with looked at me and said, Jen, what do you think you're doing? You're not going to bring back our voice. Do you really think that you can bring back our voice in this day and age? All the press wants to hear from is the religious right. They don't know we exist. So that was a rather discouraging start to my first week on the job. And I'm sure many of you can relate. We, are in perilous times for our church and our democracy. And that's why I was so excited to hear what the president is saying about United Theological Seminary and its approach, and in talking with Steve Newcom about the Center for Public Ministry, because I think words like entrepreneurial leaders, bringing together the arts and politics is where it's at today. And it's from my own ministry experience and growing Iona Conversations and watching the young people who are coming into this community that we're building. It's like the flip side of Faith in Public Life. We're trying to bring back the progressive faith voice in media and in advocacy work. And then locally, the folks who are coming into our ministry are from fundamentalist congregations that they grew up in. They're young professionals. They are fleeing intolerance and bigotry, but they have a deep spirituality, and they actually somehow in the midst of all of that have still managed to figure out who Jesus really is and what he really said. And they're just looking for a place to explore that doesn't have any of the trappings of church because they've been burned. So they are Catholic, they are Baptist, they are evangelical. Some of them are liberal Protestant, but bored as heck in their congregations because they're not getting the spiritual side of things. So we had a conversation recently in that gathering where this is in our living room, which is quite small. We had like 25 people. And this group of people is also interestingly international and very racially diverse. So we have a woman from Mississippi who's like, y'all don't know nothing about fundamentalism until you've been to Mississippi, unless you've grown up in Mississippi. And the Nigerian person looks at her and says, excuse me, I grew up in Nigeria. I know something about fundamentalism. So that is the global conversation that is starting to happen among, I think, our young people, even in our local communities. And it's what's bringing people together, from very diverse backgrounds, from Africa, from Washington, D.C., African-American community, from all over America. And that's the conversation we need to have in our congregations. It's a conversation we need, and many of you are having publicly in public life. So how did we get to where we are today? I want to tell a couple of stories. I used to really focus on the rise of the religious right. As Steve said when he introduced me, my first foray into this was writing this book called Born Again, The Christian Right Globalized. What I had seen in my work at the United Nations and on global human rights, especially on women's rights and LGBT issues, is that the Christian right in this country, which completely rejected the UN. How many of you have seen the Left Behind series or heard about that, where they said, the Secretary General is the Antichrist, totally rejected the UN and global governance and all that. But they, during my time at the UN, were starting to organize to take over UN meetings. They were actually registering to be nonprofit lobbyists at the United Nations. So they hate, it shows how well they organize, right? They don't like the system, they fear it, they think it's the Antichrist, but they organize to take it back. And so I was studying them and trying to figure out how to counter the religious right, get into their strategies. But what I ultimately concluded in my book, and what drove me to Faith in Public Life, was it wasn't that they were more powerful inherently than we were, or that people were naturally more religiously conservative, or basically they were out organizing us. I'll just say it, they were out organizing us. Now there was a sadness in this, because as I tried to organize my faith colleagues to push back on the religious right, they had a sort of low self-esteem. They were like, but we don't talk about religion publicly, That's not kosher. People don't want us to do that. And so I started to do that, and there was standing room only in the rooms where we were doing that, and the press started to show up to cover what we were doing. We were talking about feminist theology and the impact that feminist theology could have on the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And they were standing room only. But my colleagues were my biggest resistors. They kept trying to pull the carpet out from underneath those events. It was quite humorous. And my secular feminist colleagues were coming to me saying, I'm an atheist, but give me that button you're selling. Let me put that on. That was my favorite line ever. I'm an atheist, but give me that button that says religions for women's rights, and I'll wear it all day. So that was heartening. And again, I found that it was our lack of organizing and pushing back that really enabled the Christian right to emerge and dominate. And I see nods around the room, so I'm glad I'm with my people, because if I say that anywhere else, I might be run out of the room. I want to tell a story. There's this great book that if you haven't read, you'd really love. It's written by Amy Sullivan, who has been a Time magazine reporter for years and a reporter for many outlets. And she wrote a book called The Party Faithful. And it was about what happened in 2004 with the values voter and sort of how we got to that moment in American history and politics. And even if you don't like politics so much, the front end of this book is such a wonderful synthesis of how more progressive Christianity in particular, and I talk a lot about Christianity, not because I'm not interfaith, I do a lot of interfaith work, but Christianity has been the problem, and so I'm trying to figure out how Christianity can be the solution. Because it's our responsibility to take that back. And so her first two chapters are the best synthesis I've ever heard of what happened to the progressive religious voice. So she tells this amazing story, and I still got to ask her how she came by this story, but she tells the story of Reverend Sloane Coffin going on the Phil Donahue show. Y'all remember the Phil Donahue show? The Oprah Winfrey of its day. I even remember watching it growing up. After school. And so William Sloane Coffin is going on the show up against Jerry Falwell. And it's just, it must be like the early 1980s. Falwell is just starting to become a big thing and get a national presence. And Coffin is just sitting there in the chair, and he's sort of slouched back with his legs crossed, and he just looks bored as heck. And Falwell is as winsome as can be. He is folksy, he has that big smile going on, he's got the audience engaged, they're laughing. He actually seems quite reasonable. So apparently Phil Donahue takes commercial break, takes Coffin aside and says, "What the hell is wrong with you, man? You look like you're falling asleep." Coffin says, "I'm bored. Nobody's going to believe this yahoo." And of course, Phil Donahue just has a fit. He's like, "If this doesn't get you going, I don't know what the hell will." He was just beside himself, livid. But Coffin had just sort of given up on the conversation. And my experience is that that was a lot of our initial reaction to the religious right? There is no way in hell anybody's going to believe this yahoo. And we were so used, in a sense, we are the mainline Protestant churches, right? So we are the established churches. We are the establishment, right? And so we were pretty proud of our, position in society. And we just thought the media would always come to us. They would just come to our seminaries, come straight to us for comment. And before too long, the religious right had organized a network very astutely, realizing that that was the dynamic. The media did go to the highly educated mainline Protestant churches. And they said, well, what can we do about this? Well, we're going to put radio studios in the basements of some of our biggest pulpits in the country. We're going to link up with think tanks, and they're going to promote our voices as they even build their own media presence. Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank in Washington, built a think tank that wasn't just think tank, quiet, producing long, thick reports, circulating them around members of Congress. They built a think tank that was half public relations and half thinkers and writers. And they didn't circulate long, thick reports. They circulated one-pagers in full color with talking points for the people that they wanted on their team. So it took a long time for us to get wind of that. I think, too, in the story of Coffin and his lack of wanting to take on Falwell is a firm belief in progress. We are progressives, right? So we always believe that things are going to just continue to progress, to get better, because people are smart, and if we just educate them, if we just give them the facts, they will come around. And now we're starting to learn a little more. Some of you may have read George Lakoff in 2004-ish came out. His book got really big. Maybe it was written before then, but Don't Think of an Elephant was his book. And it really talked about how people don't necessarily get convinced through fact and reason. They get convinced through heart, story, relationship. Drew Weston, who's another sort of message guru based in Atlanta at Emory, he talks about this as the reptilian brain. There's a lot more brain science out there now, so that sort of primitive brain that really reacts more emotionally and primitively to things, and that's how people tend to change their mindset over time. So we have this firm belief in progress, and I think we just sort of thought, well, nobody's ever going to really follow a guy like Falwell. It just doesn't make sense this day and age. It's interesting, because we had this long history of being the establishment, the Christian right was so brilliant. They noticed that we were bureaucratic and big and deliberative, so they established a fleet of very nimble organizations that were independently run, that were not consensus-based, and they just outmaneuvered our large, ships, and just sort of went around us, and were able to really organize quickly and nimbly. I used to watch, when I first started working for the Presbyterian Church USA, denominational offices, doing this UN work and global work, my very first General Assembly was just incredible. We came to find out afterwards that the religious right within our denomination had spent $100,000 on that General Assembly to sway the General Assembly. And I was working on women's rights, and there were three things up against women in the church. They were trying to cut a young college women's program, and they were running a Christian right woman against the chair of our Women's Advocacy Committee, and one other thing that I can't even remember. And I watched as they distributed talking points, maneuvered young advisory delegates with cell phones, and just had that General Assembly. They succeeded in cutting the women's program with lies and misinformation. The woman who was being challenged in her role as Women's Advocacy Committee runner, she refused to present a case. She was humble, so she refused to present the case for her own being in charge of that committee. And the religious right woman put together this glowing bio that made her look very enlightened. She ousted her. So we then had, the committee infiltrated. And I kept saying to my colleagues, do you see it? There's this organizing effort happening all around us on the floor of the General Assembly. And nobody wanted to push back or organize against that. Either enforce the rules of the General Assembly or organize your own talking points. So I nearly got in a little bit of trouble just organizing some talking points, but had to delete those files later on the computer. So I think, we just sort of thought that this could never happen. So there was that. There was this sort of we are the establishment, that sort of passivity, thinking that nobody will ever believe these yahoos. In some ways, I call that a little bit of arrogance. It's a harsh word, but yeah, okay, I hear some amens. So there. And then along with that, arrogance, which sounds paradoxical, but I've seen these two things go hand in glove, I think we also had a sense of low self-esteem. And that was in part, I think, in the 1960s and 70s, this idea of secularization was taught to us in our colleges and universities, and even in our seminaries. I talked to a fellow clergy person many years back who actually said, we were talking about like the problems in our congregations and dying congregations, and he said, I was taught in seminary that as I went out into the world to lead congregations, I could just expect my congregation to shrink in numbers and membership because society was secularizing and people were not going to be as interested in religion anymore. Now, the interesting thing is everybody who developed secularization theory, including Peter Berger, who sort of first penned it, they have renounced that theory or severely revised it in recent decades. And we've seen that as the world's fundamentalisms have emerged. And so there's been a critique of that theory that actually it doesn't work the way we thought it would. In fact, ironically, secularization sometimes leads to a rebirth in pietism and religiosity, religious fervor and fundamentalism. It actually sort of intensifies that as people react against the harshness of secularism. You see this in places like Afghanistan, where the Soviet Union came in and invaded for a while and ran that country, and to them, synonymous in their minds with Soviet empire was secularization. And so they fought back, and the Taliban emerged. So we had a loss of faith, I think, in the importance of our unique contribution to theology and faith to public life. The way I see it, we had this pearl of great price. For me, it was feminist liberationist theology. And we never sold it to the world in the way that the religious right was able to bring their philosophy to the world through radio stations, through books. I always said to my feminist theologian colleagues, like, you guys should have books that go on Oprah Winfrey, But to some of us, that's kind of gauche, right? Like Oprah, go on the Oprah show. But why not? I grew up a kid in Atlanta, Georgia, in high school in the 1980s. I found my faith on my own, And I get emotional talking about that because, and I think it's what drives my work today. Like, here I was in this particular area of Atlanta, very well-to-do, and the churches there were country clubs, in a sense. It wasn't even that they were conservative, but, Bible Belt. There was a lot of that going on too. But the churches, I was in a Methodist church on Peachtree Street, and 10,000 members, and it was a wonderful community. I mean, we had sports, we had Wednesday night supper, we had all kinds of things. But I was a kid in Sunday school class who kept asking those darn questions, that never got answered. And as I got into high school, I was terrified about nuclear Armageddon. And I watched every apocalyptic nuclear Armageddon movie that you could find. You know, Threads was one from London, and then there was, what was the one in America the day after? Yeah. Yeah, so my dad found me one day sitting on his bed just sobbing, you know, my eyes out, my poor dad. But, you know, this was real. Like, we were on the brink of self-destruction as humanity. And luckily, I had in this private Christian school, I went to a teacher who taught us hermeneutics, biblical criticism. If my parents had known, boy, that they would have taken that teacher to task. But he brought faith to me through biblical criticism, through really looking at who Jesus was and knowing who he was. And that spoke to me. And it was the sermon text that was preached on this morning, Luke chapter 4, that became the core of my faith. Only I did not have the words to express it because I had never heard anybody articulate it. All I knew was, you know, I've come to bring good news to the poor. And what does that mean? That means like helping people who are struggling in life. And it wasn't until many years later when I went to seminary that I actually got the words. All I had was those darn little tracts with the 4 spiritual laws that you're supposed to use to convert people. And I remember I had the darndest time. I could not memorize that because it didn't make sense to me. It wouldn't stick in my head, right? So thank God for liberation and feminist theologies. And yet, when I would sit with other leaders in that field, you know, I would say things like, well, why don't we have our next meeting on a seminary campus or a Presbyterian college campus? And we never organized in that way. I remember one time trying to raise money for one of the feminist spirituality groups, and one of the women in the group, I was standing in a seminary one day, and I looked at the seminary wall, and her name was on the wall. You know, she had given a sum of money for the building, but had she ever put it into reclaiming her own voice and bringing the feminist theological spiritual voice to the denomination? That had never happened. And so I think secularization we internalized that, and we sort of thought, well, you know, our voice is less important in the public square. We actually had radio stations at one point denominationally. I remember Jim Forbes at Riverside Church used to preach on this all the time. He had a bee in his bonnet about it, and thank God. He was like, we had a radio station here at Riverside Church, and we let it go. And so we just sort of thought our voice would fade. We needed to have a quieter role in public life. And even today, as we supply media strategy to faith leaders, I often find that that is the biggest hurdle initially in trying to help them lift up their voice in their communities. They sort of think, well, that's not right. We're not supposed to talk about our religious values in public life. There was even we were doing a media training recently for an evangelical woman who is out in Colorado, the home of Focus on the Family headquarters, and she's doing work on immigration. And she said, but if I talk as a Christian about why I support immigration reform, isn't that going to alienate people, make them upset, given all my people, evangelicals, have done to hurt others? I said, all the more reason they need to hear you, a young evangelical pastor, actually talking of tolerance and support and compassion for the sojourner, for the immigrant. They need you more than ever because of the damage that's been done to faith and the damage that's been done to our democracy. So that's a lot of the first hurdle we have to overcome. So just as we were giving up our voice, a lot of politicos were stepping in and identifying folks like Jerry Falwell, getting behind him, convincing him to enter public life. They actually had to convince him to do this. You know, Paul Weyrich, who's a real sort of political strategist and identified people like Falwell as being able to swing the South over to the Republican Party, he actually did some polling to convince Falwell that he would have a following if he stepped out on these issues. A lot of times we think the religious right was just like a movement that sort of arose and it was like this just sort of thing that swept through the country, but it was created, it was concocted, it was marshaled. A load of funding went in up front to create the institutions that now run the religious right. We measured that 2 years ago. We did a research project to look at the top 50 religious right organizations. Together, they spend over $1.1 billion a year messaging to people and leading them astray. So what's the result of this? I really want to emphasize that this is a pastoral, spiritual concern as well as a political and a democratic country concern. Let me name some statistics. You guys probably heard the flurry of news coverage after this last election that the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, had elected Obama, that he won on a coalition of people of color and the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And there were a number of polls about that time that really sort of looked into this phenomenon. The statistics are that 19% of Americans now report to be unaffiliated with any religious group. 19%. That's 1 in 5 Americans. So if you look at that 20%, 23% of those are unattached believers. 23% are unattached believers. 36% are atheist agnostics. And 39% of those call themselves secular. So here comes the punchline. So I said that 36% are atheist agnostics. Now, 35% of those atheist agnostics believe in God. And I said that 23% are unattached believers. Well, 70% of these unattached believers believe in a personal relationship with God, that you can have a personal relationship with God. Those numbers are from an organization called Public Religion Research Institute. Some of you may be on their mailing list. They do a lot of polling in religion and have been very helpful to our work because they're very open and interested in figuring out sort of progressive religious thinking. So what does that mean? You know, we have all these unaffiliated people in the country. You have the rise of the N-O-N-E-S, the nuns. We also have the rise of the other kind of nuns, the N-U-N-S. I'm going to talk about them in my closing remarks because we've done and are continuing to do a lot of work to help them. But that says to me that we have a whole lot of people leaving faith, leaving institutionalized religion, not because times are changing and we're secularizing and all of that, but because they are heartbroken and disillusioned with the way Christianity has come to them in recent years, both in their congregations, but also through public life and through the media. Christianity has a serious branding problem. People have stolen our faith from us. And they've had to do that because Christianity is powerful. If you really look at what Jesus is calling you to do, it is really powerful, and it is going to turn the world upside down. So everybody at all times in history has always had to co-opt Christianity, whether it was Constantine or whether it is the Christian right today. Brian McLaren, who I know some of you have probably heard of and read his books, you know, he says in the next 20 years, he's been talking to denominational execs, in the next 20 years, 30% of our congregations are going to be closed, are going to be shutting their doors. So these are apocalyptic times for the church, in a sense. And they are dire times for our democracy. I mean, where do you start, right? We have an entrenched politics. There used to be a day and age where you could have bipartisan, reasonable conversations where members of Congress were for the good of the country. We have a ton of money in politics that is driving a lot of this polarization. If you look at the Tea Party and the rise of the Tea Party, it was heavily funded by corporate donors. Polling done on the Tea Party shows that half of the Tea Party is the religious right. So it's really just sort of a repackaging of the religious right and pulling others into that orbit for these economic times to convince people that progressive economic reform is somehow what? Not in their interest, that there is no critique to be had of Wall Street, that the housing industry, there is no critique to be had. The media contributes to the problem. 24/7 media, it's entertainment-oriented and heavily polarized. And Americans, rather than, when I was growing up, when most of you were growing up, we all met around one of 3 news stations to get our news. We had a common sort of news source that might have been biased in its own ways, but it was common. Now our listenerships are fragmented, and you either listen to Fox News. If you listen to Fox News, you'd never listen to CNN. If you live in Atlanta and you're looking for the traffic channel, you're also inevitably going to get conservative talk radio and conservative news. And until recently, progressives have done nothing to counteract that. There's some new efforts underway, but that is starting to change. So we are up against a lot. But here's the good news, and I'm going to talk more about this in my closing speech. In times of great change, and if you're interested in this, I encourage you to read Phyllis Tickle. Probably a lot of you already have. She talks about this great emergence and how every 500 years there's a shakeup in religion. This is a time of great change, and as I talk to people like Brian McLaren and Phyllis Tickle and Diana Butler-Bass, who are traveling the country and talking to denominational leaders and meeting with lots of congregations, there is something real bubbling up at the grassroots that is a whole new way of doing church. Now, we have the resources, we have the know-how, and we have the bubbling up. So if we can harness that, and a seminary like this is beginning to really think about how to harness that, this is our day to start flipping things around. And make no mistake, it is going to take some time, but it is starting to happen. And then in terms of religion and advocacy, I mean, if you just look at what happened in a state like Minnesota this past cycle, religious communities were instrumental in supporting gay marriage and in opposing this horrible voter ID bill. Like, they were front and center in leading those strategies and making sure that horrible things did not happen and that justice was won. Woohoo! Yeah, let's just celebrate that. It's awesome. Things like nuns on the bus happened. Woohoo! Yeah, they came through here, right? They came through all of the Midwest. Nuns on the bus. The nuns that wear habits, used to wear habits, don't wear habits anymore. They say, thank God. But they were instrumental in driving a conversation this fall about what kind of budget, what kind of economy we should have, and the moral issues around that. Sister Simone Campbell, the leader of that effort, was invited to speak at the Democratic National Convention. And I can say for the first time in many years, because we were key to that whole campaign, the whole progressive community rallied around the nuns. As I mentioned up front, there's been this sort of like secular religious divide in progressive politics, where it's just progressives understandably are frustrated at what they've seen with the Christian right, and they think of all religion as Christian right. I saw labor unions get behind nuns on the bus. Every progressive organization in Washington rallied around those sisters to help them with that effort. So great things are starting to happen. We're showing that if we start to use media strategy, if we really start to reclaim our voice, we can make a difference. We can reverse this trend. And I think, interestingly enough, all of these strategies are important, and we'll be talking about them over the course of these couple of days. But at the core of it all, I think, is something that actually I learned in feminist, womanist circles, is that art of reclaiming your voice. And until we can say to ourselves, our theology is so life-giving that it has to be on CNN, and it has to be on the opinion page, and it has to be preached from every pulpit. And we are so excited about this theology, we're going to start new congregations because we know our young people want this, and they're not going to come to our old buildings and our old ways of doing things, but they're going to come into something new that they define and they shape out of their own religious experience. When we start doing that, I've seen it. We can reclaim Christianity, and we can reclaim this country, and we can reclaim our faith and our voice, and it is awesomely life-giving. Amen. Amen.